Thank you, Philippe and Alex, for inviting me and for introducing me. It's a rather interesting morning. As you probably heard, Bob Dylan just won the Nobel Prize for Literature, which means that I'm addressing a marijuana conference on the same day that a guy who wrote the song, which went, "Everybody Must Get Stoned," won the Nobel Prize. Whoever thought? As a physician, of course, I'm much concerned with substances, substance use, and addiction. And addiction, of course, is a major problem in North America. With the coming legalization of marijuana in this country and in other jurisdictions, various states south of the border, the question is more and more in the forefront as to what is the legitimate or, on the contrary, illegitimate use of any particular substance, particularly cannabis. Now, it's clear that the public has already made up its mind, both in terms of opinion polls and also in terms of just what people do. So there's nothing easier in this country than for a teenager to get marijuana. Legalization or not legalization is hardly going to affect the actual use that people make of it. It means there's all the more reason why marijuana providers should take a very responsible and informed attitude towards the substance that they will be purveying to the public. Now, if I asked you a question, I'm interested in a show of hands, actually. If I asked you, how many of you think marijuana is addictive? Put your hand up. Not a whole lot. Well, actually, it's a sprinkling minority. How many think it's not addictive? Most of you think it's not. What if I said it's both, which it actually is? If I asked you, is alcohol addictive? Yes or no? Yes? How many think it's not addictive? Well, think about it, though. If it was addictive, most people in this room have had alcohol in their lives, but the number of alcoholics in the room is probably in the minority. So if alcohol is addictive, how come we're not addicted to alcohol, all of us? We've all had it. The point is, and the same thing is true of any substance, virtually any substance, whether it's marijuana or alcohol or nicotine or heroin or cocaine or crystal meth. The answer to the question, are they addictive, yes or no, is actually yes or no, depending on the individual. And so the addictive power does not reside in any particular substance, or for that matter, is food addictive? Well, again, yes or no. Is sex addictive? Yes or no. Shopping, gambling, any human behavior can be addictive, yes or no, depending on circumstances and on the individual. That's the first point. And I've certainly seen addictive use of marijuana in my medical practice over the years. And I'll define addiction for you in a moment. But I've also seen many more people use marijuana for recreational purposes with no addictive effect whatsoever. And these days, we can distinguish probably 5 areas where marijuana is used. The first one, the most common and popular, is clearly the recreational use. And by that I mean that people toke up or eat the cookie, whatever, once or twice a week, to relax or to have a good time with. But in a day-to-day functioning, it doesn't play a role, either negative or positive. And that's no doubt the commonest use. There are people that can become addicted to it, and I've seen that as well. By addiction, I mean any behavior, substance-related or not, that a person engages in, finds temporary pleasure or relief in, but suffers negative consequences, and they still don't give it up. So addiction means pleasure, craving, relief, negative consequence, inability to give it up. And there are some people that will use marijuana that way. And then the negative consequences in the case of marijuana aren't particularly heavily medical, unlike with tobacco or alcohol, which are two legal substances, by the way. On any scale of comparison, you simply cannot mention marijuana use, even heavy marijuana use, on the same page as tobacco and alcohol. The latter two, which are legal and freely advertised and sold, are far more deleterious in their medical effects. And I would even say that even if you take a substance like heroin, unless you overdose on it, it's less dangerous than nicotine or than cigarette, tobacco, or alcohol. So what we're looking at right away is the absolute irrationality and illogic of the legal approach right now, where some substances that are clearly lethal are freely marketed and advertised, and others which are relatively less harmful, or with very little potential of harm, are still illegal, which makes no sense whatsoever. So again, we have the recreational use, we have the potential addictive use. Then, of course, there is increasing evidence that marijuana has potential for medical use. And I'm sure you're all alive to that possibility. So that's been well studied, and in terms of pain relief in certain conditions, fibromyalgia, rheumatoid arthritis, even multiple sclerosis. It's been shown to be of value, and at much less risk of dependence than, say, the opiate drugs would be that we would ordinarily prescribe for pain. Again, it's not universal, and it doesn't work for everybody, and the research is still somewhat equivocal, but there's pretty good evidence that cannabis extracts can provide decent pain relief for some people on a chronic basis. Of course, it has an anti-inflammatory component to it as well. So again, and I myself take CBD for my arthritis, mild arthritis in my knee, and I have noticed a difference. That's not a controlled study, but here I am telling you that I think it makes a difference for me. That's its third use. Then is the medical use. It's used in a fourth way by a lot of people, which is self-medication. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But I had my first experience of self-medication with a client of mine when I was in family practice, which I did for 27 years prior to working in the downtown east side, which is Vancouver's drug area. And those of you that are not from here, you just go down to Hastings, a couple of blocks to your north, and then walk 10 blocks to the east, and you're in the heart of the downtown east side, where you see drug use like you've never seen it before. And but prior to that, I was in family practice. I did that for 12 years. But prior to that, I was in family practice and in palliative care. So I remember a fellow who came to my office, a patient of mine, who would be my patient for 15 years or so. I'll call him Brad. I actually don't remember his actual name, but Brad is a good approximation. And Brad comes in, he's in his 40s or 50s, and he says, "Can you give me a note for medical marijuana?" This is the days before legalization, of course, and there used to be, maybe there still is, a place called the Compassion Club that provided marijuana for people if they had a note from their doctor indicating that there's a medical reason for it. So Brad comes and says, "Would you give me a note for medical marijuana?" I said, "What for?" He says, "For the pain." And I said, "What pain? You've been my patient for 15 years. I looked through his chart. There's not a single visit for pain that is ever made to my office. I've never heard that you have any pain, nor that you have any condition that would give you pain. So if you don't have pain, why do you want me to give you marijuana?" He says, "Well, the reason you haven't seen me for pain is because I've been smoking marijuana all these years." Which kind of had an interesting logic, but I was not able to give him the note because even then, physicians were discouraged from doing so, and in the absence of any evidence, I just simply couldn't do it. So there's that self-medication aspect. And then I'll touch later upon a use that I'm not personally that familiar with, or familiar with at all in terms of personal experience, but which people that I trust and whose word is worth listening to, they talk about a spiritual use of the substance, which is kind of a hidden, perhaps, and not very well understood use of the plant, but apparently that's been with us for a long, long time. Now, as to marijuana itself, as we know, it's been around for many thousands of years, and I'm told that in certain archaeological digs, going back to the Stone Age, as far as 4,000, 6,000 years ago, they find evidence of cannabis use. So we're talking a long, long time, and as early as 2700 BC, a Chinese emperor publishes a paper or a medical compendium in which they talk about the medical use of cannabis. So we're talking a long, long, long time. It's taken us 4,500 years to catch up to where the Chinese were all those years ago. There's a very well publicized example of the young girl in the States whose parents moved to Colorado, where marijuana is legal, because she's got these uncontrollable seizures, which the medications given by her physicians did not stop, but the use of a non-hallucinogenic component of marijuana did apparently stop these seizures. And that's being studied now, so people are applying to do studies to look at the seizure control. But back in the 19th century, there already was a British physician whose name was William O'Shaughnessy, who worked in India, and he already published a paper then on marijuana as a pain reliever, as an appetite stimulant, and as something that relaxed muscles and maybe even ameliorated epileptic seizures. And this is over 100 years ago. Queen Victoria herself, in the 19th century, was prescribed marijuana extract, or I'm not sure in what form, but for menstrual cramps. Because definitely it relaxes muscles, including the muscles of the uterus that cramp. So it's got quite a history. Legally, it's also got quite a history, and it's very interesting. I was interviewed this morning, preparatory to this talk, by one of the Vancouver papers, the Vancouver Sun, for a Facebook program. And they talked about the provocative, highly charged debate about drug use and the legal control over drug use. And there is a highly charged debate about it. You know, there was a CBC program a couple of weeks ago where I was interviewed. It's a cross-country program about legalization or decriminalization, and the sheer irrationality and emotionality and even hostility of a lot of people to any kind of a calm discussion of the issues around drug use is something to behold. And part of the problem is not the lack of evidence. In fact, the least of the problem is lack of evidence. The biggest part of the problem is the utter irrationality that still pervades the public mind around questions of drug use. And this has got nothing to do with any science or any experience or any research. It has to do with what really was a very deliberate and conscious manipulation of the public mind by law enforcement agencies back in the 1920s and 30s. So specifically on marijuana, if you read the Johann Hari's book, which is called Chasing the Scream, which is a somewhat sensationalistic but also quite sensational discussion of the drug war and There happens to be a chapter on my work in his book. But when I read the book, there are many things that I didn't know about. In the 1920s, there's an American law enforcement officer who was the first drug hound in the United States, you might say, and he very deliberately, in the face of all the evidence, created the mania and the hysteria around marijuana use. He went to 30 different experts, medical experts, saying that he wants to know how harmful marijuana can be. They all told him it isn't. That wasn't good enough for him. He went ahead and instigated this war anyway, because of course it meant a lot of funding for his agency and a lot of power for him. And of course it had an element of racism in it, because the people that were using marijuana were poor blacks in the South and Mexican immigrants and Mexican and migrant workers. So there was always a racialist twinge to the anti-marijuana craze. But then you had the famous film Reefer Madness and all that very deliberate and completely distorted, baseless propaganda. And that's what informs the debate 50, 60 years, 70 years later. It's much easier to release the ghosts and goblins of prejudice and irrationality into the four corners of the earth than it is to pull them back in again after you've generated them. So that's the background. Incidentally, I was a couple of months ago, I was reading Homer's Odyssey, which is, one of the great classics of Greek literature, written 2,800 years ago, or composed 2,800 years ago, written down maybe 2,500 years ago. And there was a scene there where the Queen of Sparta, Helen, the Helen of Troy, faced who launched 1,000 ships. This is after the Trojan War already. And she's hosting a dinner where Odysseus, returning from the war, trying to get home after having been away 20 years from his home, is tired and hurt and so on, and she makes a concoction, mixing wine with some herb from Egypt, which everybody's relaxed and everybody's happy and nobody feels any sorrow that particular evening. I don't know if that was marijuana or not, but I'm pretty sure it was. Hemp being used in Egypt, and this is how back it goes. So then, how then do we approach and how then do we understand addictions, and how do we differentiate between addictive use and non-addictive use? It's not a trivial question. I wish I could tell you that marijuana is in all cases harmless. And when I wrote my book on addiction, which came out in 2008, the research I looked at up to that point on marijuana showed that it did not seem to have long-term negative effects on people, and that there's no such thing as withdrawal from it. Well, research has moved on since then, and it's always controversial, but in 2012, the United States, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences published a paper from Britain where they looked at a lot of people over 30, 40 years who began their marijuana use in adolescence, and they showed diminished mental functioning in these people. They showed diminished IQ over the years. They showed diminished neuropsychological functioning, and according to observers' reports, deterioration in their quality of life as well. They did not show the same thing when it came to people who began marijuana use as adults. So there's definitely a question about what is the impact of this substance on the developing brain of the young human being. Now, the same legitimate question also exists about substances that we legally prescribe to kids. For example, in the US, there are 500,000 children right now, at least, who are receiving antipsychotic medications. And they're getting them not to, because they're psychotic, they're not. They're getting them to calm them down, because we don't know how else to, when I say we, I mean as a society, we don't understand human child behavior enough to be able to regulate it, so we just medicate it. But the long-term effects on the developing brain, not good news. And side effects such as diabetes and weight gain and skin changes and so on, we're already documenting them and having to deal with. So marijuana is not the only substance where we have to be careful. As I say, some legally prescribed pharmaceuticals seem to be potentially much worse, actually. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be careful with marijuana as well. And of course, the adolescent population is precisely the population that legalization is not going to affect one way or the other, in the sense that they can already get all the drugs they want, all the marijuana they want, and they will continue to get it. Even if you set the legal age for the purchase of marijuana at, say, 19 or 20 or whatever, wherever they choose to set the limit, the fact is that's not going to stop adolescent marijuana use. But as providers or as people working medically or otherwise with the plant and its products, we should really be aware of the potential risk that so far fairly persuasively demonstrated to the adolescent brain. That aside, let me now look at the question of addiction and to see what that is about. But let me also begin by saying that, well, it's very interesting. In Colorado, which was the first state to legalize marijuana, who was the very first person to buy marijuana? Anybody know? He was an Iraqi war vet. Not accidental. Because a lot of those people suffer PTSD, and I know my friend Philippe, who introduced me, is now involved in a project to study the use of cannabis in the treatment of PTSD. So that's a frequent self-medication. The mayor of Denver, Colorado, of course, said this is a terrible thing because he's seen all these people begin marijuana as the gateway drug, and then they become addicted to all kinds of other substances. Well, he's probably describing what he saw. He saw people using marijuana and then using other drugs, but he may as well have said Coca-Cola, because people drink Coca-Cola at a much earlier age than they start using marijuana, and then they go on to become drug users, or soda water, or O. Henry bars. You know, in other words, just because something precedes the use of something else doesn't mean that A led to B. And there's absolutely no evidence that marijuana is any kind of a gateway drug to anything. You can probably show that, in fact, if there's a gateway drug, it's cigarettes. Because a lot more people who are drug users start with that than with anything else. But nobody's arguing that cigarettes is a gateway drug. There are no gateway drugs. They're just drugs. But there's probably a good reason why people that begin marijuana use then go on to use other harder drugs. Just as good reason why people who begin with cigarettes will then go on to use other drugs. Not because the use of the one substance leads to the use of the other, but because who are the people who need to have their consciousness changed? Who are the people that need to have their discomfort soothed by a substance or another? So again, if I give you my definition of addiction, that of any behavior, substance-related or not, that a person craves, finds temporary pleasure or relief in, but suffers negative consequences as a result of, and does not give it up despite those negative consequences. I said any behavior, doesn't have to be substances. If I asked you the question in this room, just please raise your hand. How many of you would acknowledge that at some time or another in your life, you've had some kind of an addictive behavior? Yeah, we have about 90% honesty in this room. That's good to know. So when you ask yourself the next question, then, in fact, I'll ask you to just raise your hand and tell me. I'm not going to ask you what you used or what you did or when or for how long. I'm interested in what did it do for you. What did you like about it? What did you get from it in the short term? So, who would tell me? Escape from? From feeling. Okay, so that, thank you, that implies that the feelings that you had were painful and uncomfortable and stressful. I mean, nobody has to escape from good feelings, right? So it's a relief of emotional pain or emotional discomfort. Fair enough? Okay, anybody else? What did it do for you? Whatever you did, yeah? Focus. It helped you focus. Great. Sorry? Connection? Connection with other people, you mean? With anything. You just felt more connected to the world. Okay, great. And maybe take one more. I'm sorry? Creativity. So creativity, connection, escape from distress, and focus. Now you tell me, who on earth does not want those qualities? Who on earth does not want to be connected? Who on earth does not want to be focused? Who on earth does not want to be... Sorry, who would you say? The government? I'm talking about rational individuals here. No. The connection, relief of distress, focus, creativity. These are normal human aspirations. In other words, the addiction wasn't the problem. It wasn't your primary problem. Your primary problem was, how come you're on God's green earth with 7 billion other people and you're not connected? Your problem is you got so much emotional distress or pain that you need to escape. Your problem is that your creativity is your very nature, but somehow it's blocked and you need to have it unblocked. Your problem is that for some reason your brain is unable to focus. So the addiction is not your primary problem. Your addiction is your attempt to solve a problem. Therefore, to look upon addiction as kind of a disease that people are born with is absolute nonsense, which is the official medical view, that it's a primary brain disease mostly determined by genetics. It isn't any of that. The real question is, what happened to you to block your creativity? What happened to you that your brain didn't develop the focus? What happened to you that you had so much distress and pain that you had to escape from it? These are life experience issues. They're not medical issues. And the addiction in every single case is an attempt to solve the problem. Now, I have relatively little time with you this morning, so I can't go into all the physiology of it, but let me tell you just a few things. First of all, as I've just pointed out, addictions are always an attempt to solve a problem, but they're not the primary problem, number one. Number two, the qualities that the addicted individual wants are simply normal human qualities. They just want to feel like normal human beings. That's number two. Number three, people are almost always, in the case of substance use, self-medicating something or other. Now, marijuana is very interesting because, again, my friend Philippe has shown in one of his studies, people typically self-medicate anxiety and pain and sleep problems with marijuana. That's a self-medication. You know what people also self-medicate? This is less known, but they self-medicate ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. They self-medicate it not only with marijuana, they also self-medicate it with stimulants. And my guess is you probably had a stimulant addiction. Stimulants are crystal meth, cocaine, nicotine, and caffeine. And these substances give you a rise in the level of a brain chemical called dopamine, which is essential for focus and motivation and a feeling of being present. So the stimulant addict is very often self-medicating ADHD because people with ADHD lack dopamine and they don't know how to focus. and they lack motivation. But people also self-medicate ADHD with marijuana because it soothes. And I've been diagnosed with the condition myself, so I know what it feels like internally. And you've got this churning, ever hyperactive brain that you just want to break from every once in a while. And people find that marijuana just soothes the hyperactivity of their brains, so they self-medicate. In fact, a relative of mine, a young man, well, he's in his 20s now, but in his teens, he was a heavy marijuana smoker. In fact, he still is. And I'm rather concerned about it. But I would say to him, without mentioning his name, hey, why are you using so much? He says, well, you won't believe this, Uncle Gabor, but when I smoke marijuana, I can listen better to the teacher. And he was clearly self-medicating his ADHD. Now, he could listen better. What he would remember is a totally different issue. Probably not very much. But it is a self-medication on that level. And all addictions are. And particularly, people self-medicate PTSD, for example, with any number of substances, particularly marijuana and the opiates like heroin. And given what you said about escape, and really, which is a form of emotional pain relief, all addictions function as emotional pain relievers. So my mantra when it comes to addiction is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And if you understand people's pain, you have to look at their lives. So the people that are at risk for addiction of any sort are the people that have suffered too much pain in their lives. Now in the downtown east side, again, 10 blocks to the east from here, where I worked for 12 years, in those years, I did not have a single female patient who had not been sexually abused as a child. They all had been. And that's why the pain. And the men had been abused. Some of them sexually, some in other ways. Every single one of them. And that's not just my particular experience. It's also what the large-scale studies show, looking at tens of thousands of people, that the more childhood adversity there is, childhood adversity meaning sexual, physical, emotional abuse, a parent dying, a parent being jailed, for example, for marijuana possession, a divorce, a parent beating another, a parent being mentally ill. For each of these adverse experiences, the risk of addiction goes up exponentially. Why? Because addictions are always an escape from pain. And there's something else that we have to consider, which again is scientifically not even controversial, but which most physicians unfortunately are unaware of, because it's not taught in the medical schools yet, which is rather strange, because it's not even new information, which is that the human brain develops in interaction with the environment. So if you take a substance like opiates, heroin, or morphine, the reason they work is because we have receptors in our brains and in our bodies. We have molecules where the opiate molecule will fit and somehow beneficially affect the functioning of a cell. So we have messenger molecules, the opiates in this case, and we have the receptors, which is the cell surface molecule that receives the opiate. Now, of course, as you know, we also have cannabinoid receptors as well. And in 1982, an Israeli physician or physiologist found the receptor for cannabinoids. And there are several types of cannabinoid receptors. Why do we have receptors for opiates and for cannabis? Because we have an internal system. We have an internal system of opiates. And the internal opiates are called endorphins. And endorphin means internal or endogenous morphine-like substance. Now, why do we have an internal opiate system? Because they're necessary for life. They're necessary for pain relief, they're necessary for the experience of pleasure and reward, and they're necessary for the experience of connection and love. And without that, we wouldn't live. The reason without that we wouldn't live is because the human child, infant, is the most helpless and dependent and least mature of any creature in the universe. Without that connection, there's simply no life. And the endorphins help make possible that connection between mother and parent and infant. Now, That's why we have endorphins. Similarly, cannabinoids. We have receptors for cannabinoids because we have an internal endocannabinoid system. So this is not a mistake that cannabis should somehow have such powerful impacts in the human body and brain. It's because we have our own system. They're essential for life. And they have many, many functions. We're still finding out what they are, but they certainly have a role to play in reproduction, in pain relief, and cannabinoid receptors are particularly prevalent in our pain pathways, in the brain, in the spinal column, and in our peripheral nervous system. A role in controlling inflammation, in controlling anxiety, and other functions. That's why we have a cannabinoid system. But these brain systems, we're not born with them. We're born with the potential for them to develop, but it takes the environment to promote that development. And without the proper environmental input, there's simply improper development. And this, it will surprise you. It would certainly surprise most of my medical colleagues. I'm not going to find the article for you now, but I can cite it. It's from the Journal of Pediatrics in February 2012. The article is from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, and they point out, summarizing decades of research, that the most important, the critical influence on the physiological development of the human brain is, guess what? The mutual responsiveness of adult-child relationships. In other words, how the parents are able to connect, to tune with the infant is the dominant influence on the physiological development of all these receptors, brain systems, and so on that are implicated in addiction. And now when you go back to the large-scale studies on who becomes addicted, it's the people that lack those connections. And the more and more we have, and their brains then didn't develop the proper mechanisms, no wonder then when they do a substance from the outside or they engage in a behavior that gives them a boost of those chemicals, all of a sudden they're hooked. So that's why substances are addictive, yes or no. It depends who uses them and for what purpose. And those people whose physiology has been affected by adverse experiences in childhood, who are therefore carrying a lot of emotional pain as well, and whose physiology is not fully balanced, they're going to be prone to become addicted. And that's just what addiction is all about. It's not a disease that you inherit. It's a physiological and psychological compensation for life stress. And the more stress in a society, the more addiction you're going to see. So if you look at the most highly addicted segments of the North American population, well, who would they be? Of course, in Canada and in the US as well, it's the Aboriginals in North America, our native First Nations people, or American Indians, as you call them in the States. And why would they be the most addicted? They'd be the most addicted because they're the most traumatized and the most stressed. And they suffered near genocide, of course, especially in the States. Deprivation of their lands and livelihood and spiritual ways, and utter degradation. And then these are the people that turn to substances and other addictive behaviors to escape from all that misery. But if you're looking at what's happening right now with the opioid epidemic, all these people dying of overdoses, you know, in the States, something like 130 people a day die of overdoses, which means that every month you've got a 9/11. Every month you've got a World Trade disaster. And then you have the war on terrorism. I mean, how many Americans actually die because of genuine terrorism? I'm not saying it's not an issue. I'm saying by comparison, it's not even a problem. But where is the money being placed and all the public energy and fear into the terrorism fight? And when it comes to drugs, we just keep on doing what we've been doing for 100 years, this insane war on drugs that's making things worse and worse all the time. There's absolutely no rationality to any of it. No scientific rationality and no legal rationality as well either. So again, addiction is always rooted in childhood loss and trauma in every single case. And of course, every once in a while, somebody says, well, I had a perfectly happy childhood, but I'm still addicted. And usually it takes me 3 minutes to find that what they thought was a happy childhood is really a question of denial of their own pain. So, if you ask a really traumatized person, like if you knew somebody who said that the world is a horrible place, the world is a horrible place, you think he's a traumatized person. He's somebody who'd learned that the world is not safe, and it's dangerous, and he has to fight like a vicious tiger in order to survive. Now this man is running for the presidency of the United States. You're talking about a highly traumatized person. A highly traumatized person. But he thinks he had a happy childhood. His opponent, who is traumatized, not nearly to the same degree, also thinks she had a very happy childhood. Whereas the evidence is quite the contrary. And I think in tomorrow's Global Mail, a Canadian paper, I just read an article about these two. I'm not going to go into it. But they're examples of two traumatized people in denial of their childhood suffering. So that's always at the basis of it. Now, before I take your questions, let me then come to the final use that I mentioned in terms of marijuana, which is again the spiritual use. I mentioned this Chinese emperor who 2,700 years ago wrote about, spoke about marijuana, and there's a quote that I like to, he says about marijuana, this is the Emperor Shen Nung in 2700 BC, he says, if taken over a long term, it makes one communicate with spirits and lightens the body. So some kind of spiritual communion. And just yesterday I scanned through a book on the spiritual use of cannabis. And I know people, and there's some in this room, who use cannabis as a kind of sacrament. Now, the issue with any substance, and I work myself with psychedelics in healing. I don't work with marijuana, but I work with other plant substances in a healing capacity. I see their value. I'm an agnostic when it comes to marijuana and spiritual use. I'm saying I have no experience with it, and I have certain concerns about it. But people I know and respect have written a book on the spiritual use of cannabis, and here's this Chinese emperor talking about that 4,700 years ago. And as the book that I just read points out, it's not just a question of a substance, it's a question of what they call set and setting. And set is who you are when you're using it, what your intention is, why are you using it. Are you using it, like MDMA, ecstasy. As you know, it can be used in raves for people just to freak out on and have a good time. MDMA is also being studied very seriously and very successfully as a treatment for PTSD. It's called MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, and people take the MDMA and they have a psychotherapeutic session, and the results when it comes to PTSD are so far off the charts. And I know psychiatrists, both in the States and Canada, who are involved in a study who are telling me that. So it's going to go into third phase trials now. So, and Philippe and his study on PTSD and marijuana at UBC. So the intention makes a huge difference. Why are you using it? And then the setting. Are you using the substance with a bunch of immature peers just for escape purposes? Or is there an intention in mind that's about connection, that's about spiritual expansion, that's about delving into deeper parts of yourself? I have not experienced it that way. I've not participated in any such sacramental use, but again, people I respect tell me that they do, and I have to at least believe their experience. Now, just to conclude this, again, most people using marijuana will not be using it for medical reasons. It doesn't matter what they say. They'll be using it for recreational use. I got nothing to argue with that. I mean, whether I want to use it myself is one issue, but why wouldn't I support the legalization of a substance that in every way is less harmful than what's legally sold now? What sense would that make? So people are going to use it that way. Very exciting, of course. Very exciting is the medical use. And again, as a physician, I did employ it that way. So I worked in palliative care for 7 years. And we looked after terminally ill people at Vancouver Hospital. And although we didn't use it for pain control then, I just didn't know enough about it. This is in the 1990s. We certainly used it for nausea that was due to cancer or the treatment of cancer. And we prescribed it in the hospital, on the ward, for that reason. So there's the medical use. There'll continue to be the self-medication use, where people are not going to ask a doctor, but when they feel anxious, they're going to use it. Now, of course, I do see a danger there, because when people are anxious, it's never about nothing. It's all about something in their lives. And again, anxiety usually goes back to childhood loss or trauma or something that happened. You got to deal with the causes. And pharmacology never deals with causes. It only deals with effects. But that doesn't mean it can't be used. It doesn't mean that there's no value to it. But let's recognize that for any human issue, you have to deal with the causative dynamics, the trauma, the pain, the fear, wherever it happens to be.
Yeah, but I just wanted to say 20 minutes just so you know, and so we can get some questions in just so you know. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I'm just about to finish. So. See, Alex, I got ADD, so when interrupted, my mind just loses its track. Oh yeah. So I was just reviewing the uses. So I was saying that the medical use is very exciting, and I'm sure that fairly soon we're going to have more and more evidence that it's got very specific indications. And most exciting, of course, would be its use in seizure control. What would I say to people that would be providing marijuana to the public? Just that you need to be informed, that you should not be evangelists for your product. You should, in my view, you should make it available. There was a study or a series of studies in the Global Mail newspaper, a national paper in Canada, that looked at marijuana products in a number of outlets in Ontario mostly, I think maybe across Canada, and they found a huge variation in the quality of what was being sold, the amount of impurities, pesticides, and so on that were present. So, you know, if you're going to take this on, you have a responsibility, which I'm sure you're aware of, that what you do provide should be well-studied, well-controlled, as pure as you can possibly make it, and that you give it to people for specific indications, if you're going to be using it for medical use. So that's my biggest concern, is that the medical use should be well understood and well regulated, but not more so than other substances. As a matter of fact, as I've already said, there are many legal pharmaceuticals that are far more dangerous than marijuana will ever be. Be also aware of its addictive potential, not that you can stop people that way, but it's possible, perhaps it's possible, that you develop relationships with your clients, in which case you can engage them in conversation about what they're using and why they're using it. And if you do perceive an addictive pattern, then you might want to talk to people about, not in a controlling or negative or punitive way, but in a very human and compassionate way of, well, have you thought about what you're escaping from? And are there some ways to help you heal and deal with that? Because there are, once people recognize the problem. So it's an exciting time. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right. Do you have time for some questions, Doctor?
Yeah, we about
Oh, you have a question here? Watermelon and I are going to wander around. We'll bring you the microphones. Pardon me. I got to
Can I ask a
remind you,
question?
please keep your question relatively brief. No need to ramble on about the entire history of cannabis before you get to your point. We know how stoners are. Here we go.
Hello. Thank you for coming and talking live. It's been a pleasure listening to you.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask a question about in the rehab world. What are your opinions on the rehab systems that are out there right now? When somebody does realize that they have to deal with the pain and now they have to get fixed, the current system is rehab and it's not that effective in our opinion. So curious on your thoughts.
Well, the problem is that the rehab industry, for the most part, and the medical specialists who deal with addiction, for the most part, ignore one little word, which is called trauma. So there's very little trauma-informed care. Most of rehab is about the behavior of addiction, but not about the driving dynamics of addiction. So if you're not going to deal with the causes, why do you expect to succeed? So typically, there's a huge relapse rate, in my view, because we're not addressing causes, we're only addressing effects. And I travel throughout the States and internationally quite extensively just talking about trauma and addiction. Any addiction, by the way, not just the drugs. So what's missing, and the 12-step programs also miss that piece. That's very, very interesting from the 12-step point of view. First of all, they don't talk about trauma. It's just not in the 12 steps anywhere. The founder of AA, Bill W., was a traumatized child. His parents abandoned him when he was 12 years old. And there was issues even before then, yet they don't talk about trauma. The founder of AA, Bill W., also used LSD that really helped him overcome his alcoholism. But they don't talk about that either. So when you got limited perspectives, you're going to have limited treatments. When you have limited treatments, you're going to have limited results. And that's what I see as the problem.
Okay, I have a question here for you, Gabor.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm curious, you referred to a study that was demonstrating that there is damage to underdeveloped brains
Yeah.
with the use of cannabis. Do you know whether or not that study took a look at microdosing and what dosage?
Oh no,
how
this
that plays
this
in?
was not about microdosing. This is about people that have been smoking or using marijuana since adolescence, over decades.
Do you know if there's any looking into what microdosing could do for young people in terms of treating anxiety, et cetera? Do you know if they're looking at that?
If there are such studies. But first of all, one of the problems with doing marijuana studies is that in the States, it's still a Schedule I drug, right? And that means it has no possible medical use, which is just nuts. You know, and which limits people's capacity to do studies. So there may be, I know they've done studies with microdosing of mushrooms, for example. I'm not aware of any with marijuana yet. Doesn't mean they don't exist, but I'm not aware of them. But this one study that I mentioned was really about uncontrolled marijuana use in adolescents.
My name is Neil Magnuson. I've been a chronic cannabis user since I was 15.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm brain damaged. I think that, that's right, I wouldn't know.
Yeah, I mean, really, how
But,
would
you
you
know,
know? How would you know?
That's right, how would I know? I could very well be. But, you know, I think that, in my opinion, that's not always true. I'm very skeptical, by the way, of anything coming out of the UK or the United States. And I don't even respect doctors, with all due respect.
Thank you very much.
They've been lying to us for a very long time. I think that there's no non-medical use of cannabis, that I think that even if you're chronically using it as a teenager, I think you're still trying to escape the stress and the emotional separation of trying to be a teenager and grow up.
Fair enough.
I think that there's no non-spiritual use of cannabis, that anytime you're... My question is, do you agree, like with the last question as well, is it not more dose-related with respect to how adolescents would use cannabis and have adverse results or not?
Look, first of all, I would not argue with your personal experience, okay? And with any study, you look in the statistics and percentages. You're not looking at that every person who does this will have this particular effect. What we're looking at, over a number of people, large number of people over decades, do we see a pattern? And that's what the study showed. Now, if you're not going to trust physicians, don't even ask me a question. What can I tell you? Because I'm a physician, okay? But having said that, and you know what? There are plenty of reasons not to trust physicians. What I mean is plenty of reasons to be skeptical, but not to be cynical. Okay? Now, in terms of, again, the problem with adolescence is how can you control and measure the amount of marijuana a kid is using when the substance is illegal and they get it from their buddies in the schoolyard? So there's just no possible way to have information on that.
You had said it's not the only substance of concern. I might argue that it would be the least substance of concern with respect to adolescents.
Well, I think you heard me say that. I think you heard me say that when it comes to tobacco or alcohol or anything else, it's much less harmful. Okay? So, looks like you're looking to disagree with me even when there's no disagreement. So,
I have a question here for you.
Yeah.
First of all, thanks, Dr. Maté. I've followed your work on adverse childhood experiences in the past, and really I'm excited that you're here talking. Could you talked briefly about the medical community being sounds like maybe intentionally uninformed on addiction, and can you talk about maybe why that is? Is it taking direction from the DSM, or is it like, and how does that change, if ever?
Well, there are many reasons. One is that addiction is not taught in the medical schools. At most, they get a couple lectures on it. If you're lucky these days, not enough. Trauma. I lecture to medical students. In 4 years, they don't hear the word trauma once in most medical schools. Not once. Not that they don't get a lecture on it or a course on it. And even though trauma is probably the most basic cause, well, certainly of all addictions and many mental health issues, many physical health issues as well, which is another conversation altogether. But if you look at childhood adversity and rheumatoid arthritis, is much higher, the relationship. So despite that, they don't talk about it. So most doctors are just not informed. Why not? It's because of a whole lot of considerations that really I'm not going to go into, but one of them is that for the physician to deal with the whole mind-body unity, they'd have to open themselves up to conversations they're simply not trained to have. And also it's much more time consuming. Much easier for you to come to me with a pain problem and me giving you a prescription for something than me talking to you about how your nervous system is hypersensitized because of childhood trauma and what you can do about that as an adult. So in terms of emotional comfort, it's much easier to just write a prescription. In terms of time, it's much quicker to do so. And furthermore, when you look at who funds the research, it's the drug companies, so the information that doctors get is for the most part self-serving when it comes to many, many treatments.
Okay, I have another question. Oh, sorry.
Hi, Gabor, thank you so much for, there we go. Gabor, thank you so much for the chat this morning. I really appreciate your insights. Part of the conversation that really spoke to my heart was the use of spirit plant medicines in the resolution of trauma. And I wanted to ask you, in your experience, what was it about the consciousness shift that people experienced while going into those altered states in the resolution of trauma, and also how important is the integration process after that experience?
Well, if you come to San Francisco with me, where I'm flying this afternoon, I'll be giving a talk on that subject at the California Institute of Integrative Studies in San Francisco. Here I can give you, what's going to be a 2-hour lecture, here I can give you 60 seconds on it. The traumatized person experiences themselves in a certain way, as vulnerable, as helpless, as at fault. Because children who are hurt or traumatized, they think it's about themselves. They can't help it. That's how a child thinks. And so, with the psychedelic experience, and again, I have to emphasize the context has to be very important. It's not that you go home and you do this on your own. You do it under guidance, with the right kind of leadership and support. You get to experience yourself in a different way. You get to learn that you're not that helpless little worthless individual that underneath whatever you think you believe, you actually believe about yourself. If you look at someone like Donald Trump, there's a man who absolutely hates himself. He thinks he's worthless. Hence, he doesn't think it consciously. He believes it unconsciously. Hence his grandiosity and his absolute denial of reality. These are compensations. I would love to invite him to one of my ceremonies. For his sake, he would actually wake up, potentially, because you get to experience yourself in a deeper level because the psychedelics bypass the mental defenses that we build up against reality. And in terms of integration afterwards, I don't care what the substance is, it's not just the experience itself, it's then how you incorporate that into your life, and that's an ongoing process. And that's, again, what is meant by set and setting. The intention and who you are, and then the context, and then the follow-up are always very, very important, which is true also for marijuana. If you're going to use it in any healthful kind of way, you have to have integration, you have to have follow-up, and you have to have ongoing contact.
That's awesome. Thank you very much. I would also like to be there when Trump takes a giant dose.
Good morning.
Hi.
My name is, hold it, okay. I'm an enrolled tribal member out of California, and you mentioned the genocide and effects that happened to our people. Are there any studies available about intergenerational trauma? How cannabis can be used or hemp can be used to deal with that?
Well, that's a really interesting question. First of all, multi-generational trauma is the basis of addiction. And the reason I mentioned the Aboriginal peoples is because it's the clearest example I can find. Because here you had people that actually had no addiction whatsoever prior to contact, even though they had access to substances. There was hemp here for sure, and I don't know, alcohol in some areas, peyote for sure, but there was no addiction. If there was any substance used at all, it was purely ceremonial. There was tobacco, but there was no addiction to tobacco. It was used purely ceremonially. So as long as the context is right and the culture is healthy, you've got the responsible use of substances. Then you get this multi-generational trauma, which you know very, very well. I just read a book this summer called The Empire of the Summer Moon, and it's about the Comanches, who at some point were the most feared and militarily powerful native nation in the United States. One of the last chiefs, once the battle has been lost, their people have been confined to the reservations, he gets into peyote. And as a spiritual sacrament, as a way of dealing with the pain, as a way of healing. And when people criticized him, this is in the 1890s, his name is Quanah Parker. He was one of the last leaders of the Comanches. And when people criticized him for using this substance to contact God, to get in touch with a higher reality, you know what he said? He said something very telling. He said, I got this on my computer, he said, the white man goes to his church and talks about Jesus, but the Indian goes into his teepee and talks to Jesus. So I'm not aware of cannabis being used that way, but I can't see why it couldn't be. I can't see why it couldn't be. Again, it's set and setting, it's intention, guidance, and context. So that would be an interesting, certainly peyote is used that way. Certainly I work with this Peruvian plant called ayahuasca that's used that way. And I've used ayahuasca with native people here in BC on a very limited basis, but very encouraging results. I can see cannabis being used that way, depending again on who's guiding it and with what intention.
Thank you, Gabor, so much. Give it up for Gabor Maté.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabor. Woo!